in this episode of Plants of the Gods. Join ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin as we embark on a journey learning about the world's most popular alcoholic beverage, beer. In the first half of this two-part discussion, we'll learn about beer's origins in the Fertile Crescent and its evolution throughout early human history.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Plants of the Gods. I'm Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team, and I'm your host. Today, we're going to discuss the ethnobotany of beer from several unusual and little-known perspectives. Did you know that some scientists and historians have hypothesized that civilization was invented in the Fertile Crescent so people could brew and drink beer? Did you know that hallucinogenic beers were crafted in the Middle Ages? Or that a beer-drinking song served as the basis for the Star-Spangled Banner? But first, some memorable quotes about beer. One of the places most identified with beer culture is Ireland, where brewing can be traced back to ancient times. Some accounts claim that it was St. Patrick himself, who was born and raised in England, who not only introduced Christianity to Ireland, but brewing as well. Brendan Behan was a much-beloved 20th century Irish poet and playwright. Gavin Smith, in his classic book, The Global History of Beer, wrote, quote, "Despite fierce competition, Brendan Behan emerges as the king of Irish drinking writers. Indeed, he famously described himself as not a writer with a drinking problem, but a drinker with a writing problem." Behan enjoyed a glass of porter or stout as much as his contemporaries, and he enjoyed a dozen glasses even more. Comedian Tina Fey said, "In a recent study, scientists report that drinking beer can be good for the liver." I'm sorry, did I say scientists? I meant Irish people. So said Tina. So embedded is beer in Irish culture that in Ireland, blood donors were given a free pint of Guinness, a practice which only ended in 2009. Gavin Smith noted that Welsh artists also enjoyed their beer. Quote, "The Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, the author of Under Milkwood, also had a fondness for beer, and he had a penchant for lining up a series of glasses of light ale on the bar and downing them in quick succession as a hangover cure. Shortly before his death in New York, he reputedly returned to the Hotel Chelsea where he was staying and declared, quote, 'I've had 18 straight whiskeys. I think that's the record.' Then he died. Perhaps, according to Smith, quote, 'he should have stuck to beer after all.' The Texan country and western singer Kinky Friedman, best known for songs like Get Your Biscuits in the Oven and Your Buns in the Bed, and, more controversially, They Don't Make Jews Like Jesus Anymore, was quoted as saying, quote, 'Beauty is in the eye of the beer holder,' end of quote. But I want to delve into the heart of the episode by solving the greatest ancient mystery of all time, perhaps the ultimate cold case. Since ancient beer is the key to the story, we might call it the ultimate cold case of beer. About 40 years ago, an anthropology grad student from the University of Massachusetts was visiting a research lab in Detroit to learn techniques for making thin sections of bones from archaeological finds so they could be studied under the microscope. One of her advisors was George Armalagos, a bioarchaeologist renowned for his research on ancient human diets and health. She was studying bones of ancient Nubians, that is, from Sudan, excavated at Kulubnarti Island in the Upper Nile. The bones had been dated to around 400 BCE. Serendipity was about to play a major role in a major scientific discovery. The grad student looked for a standard microscope, but all were in use. Another researcher suggested you try a microscope that used ultraviolet light instead, assuming the results would be the same. Such proved not to be the case. When she put the bone section under the microscope and turned on the ultraviolet light, the specimen immediately fluoresced with a yellow-green color. Fortunately, an orthopedic surgeon named Harold Frost was working in the lab, and he knew what caused bones to emit that peculiar yellow-green glow: the presence of the antibiotic tetracycline. At first, the researchers could not believe what they were seeing. According to the then current thinking, antibiotics were first discovered by Dr. Alexander Fleming in his London lab in 1928, which earned him a Nobel Prize, and tetracycline was not found until 1945 in a soil sample from western Indiana. Armelagos described his shock at the findings, quote, "My heart stopped as it was such a remarkable discovery. It's as if you were unwrapping an ancient Egyptian mummy and found it wearing a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses." The scientists worried that the Nubian materials might have been contaminated with tetracycline being consumed by someone in the lab, but the drug was deeply embedded in the Nubian bones. And one of the chemists on the project was able to extract the antibiotic from the Nubian bones and showed that it could still kill bacteria more than 1,500 years after the ancient Nubians had made it. We now know that tetracycline is produced by streptomycetes, mold-like bacteria that often flourish in hot, dry sands like those in the Nile Valley. The prevalence of tetracycline found in the bones from other parts of Nubia and adjacent Egypt led the researchers to conclude that tetracycline was part of the ancient diet, and the key component in their diet that contained the antibiotic was beer. The beer produced in the ancient Nile Valley at that point was a slightly alcoholic and highly nutritious gruel. By mimicking what they know of the recipe and the production of ancient beer in that region, the investigators were able to produce a brew with significant amounts of tetracycline, just like the ancient Nubians had been able to do 1,500 years earlier. There are several important lessons in this story. The first is that indigenous pre-literate people, then and now, may have important lessons to teach us. This is perhaps the single most important message of the Plants of the Gods podcast. The second is that nature is a seemingly unending treasure chest of therapeutic compounds, and the combination of indigenous wisdom and natural products, be they plants, magic frogs, or even fungi like the streptomycetes that produce the Nubian tetracycline, can offer titanic benefits to our species. One concrete example of an opportunity missed. With the advent of mechanized warfare in the mid-19th century, like the Crimean War or the American Civil War, at least as many soldiers died of infections as they did from the actual wounds. It wasn't until the aforementioned discovery of antibiotics by Fleming in 1928 that penicillin and other antibacterial drugs entered the mainstream. But if antibiotic beer had been brewed and used by the ancient Nubians in 400 AD, and, for example, over 4 million soldiers died of infections in the Civil War in the 1860s, think of how many lives could have been saved between 400 AD and 1928, and how much suffering could have been alleviated if we'd all been drinking Nubian beer. And further proof that the ancient Nubians, and probably the Egyptians as well, knew what they were doing. Records indicate that these early inhabitants of the Nile Valley valued beer as a treatment for gingivitis, a form of gum disease caused by various bacteria. A preferred treatment for gingivitis by today's dentists is tetracycline, the same antibiotic created, brewed, and used in ancient Africa. A few definitions are in order as we dive deeper into beer. Mead is an alcoholic beverage that is made by fermenting honey with water. Wine is alcohol produced by the fermentation of sugar from fruits, usually grapes. Beer is alcohol produced by the fermentation of sugar from starches, usually grains, usually barley. To summarize, wine is produced by the fermentation of fruits like grapes, while beer is produced by the fermentation of grains, usually barley. According to the Oxford Companion to Beer, and every beer lover should have that on their shelf, beer is the world's most popular alcoholic beverage, and most beer is made from barley. Why is that? Barley was one of the earliest cultivated crops, first domesticated in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East thousands of years ago. It's rich in enzymes like amylase and beta-glucanase that can help convert starches into sugars during fermentation and harbors vital proteins that feed the yeast during the same process. That means that when you drink beer, you're not only getting a nice buzz, you're getting a nice meal. Barley is widely adaptable and highly resistant crop, relatively resistant to both drought and saline soils, and it grows well in a variety of marginal environments. Barley not only feeds humans, but is excellent animal fodder as well. In fact, 70% of the barley grown today is used as animal feed, while the other 30% is used to make beer and whiskey. As a side note, barley has an important medical use as well. One of the compounds extracted from barley in the early 20th century was the inspiration for the creation of the molecule lidocaine, a widely used local anesthetic in modern dentistry. Modern humans first arose about 300,000 years ago, and for most of that time, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. But about 10,000 years ago, small groups settled down and began to cultivate crops in the Fertile Crescent. Some researchers, and many beer drinkers, have suggested that the creation of human settlements and the development of agriculture, essentially the invention of civilization as we know it, was to generate a steady supply of cereal grains to make beer. Pursuing that line of reasoning, one might conclude that beer invented civilization. Or in the words of the Oxford Companion, quote, "The history of beer, quite literally, is the history of human civilization." In the Plants of the Gods episode on the Ethnobotany of wine, I discussed how many creatures, from fruit flies to elephants, seek out fermented fruits to catch a buzz from alcohol. The Oxford Companion to Beer states, "It's reasonable to believe that we and other animals evolved according to advantages alcoholic beverages can confer. Fruit, when ripe, gives off an alluring scent that tells animals that it's full of sugar and ready to eat. Ripe fruits can become quite alcoholic when naturally present yeasts begin to consume the sugars. Animals get the benefits of the food value of the fruit, but also undoubtedly find value in the physiological effects of consuming alcohol. The fruiting plants, in turn, derive the benefits of the animal's actions as a disperser of its seeds. That is to say, that the animals propagate the plants by spreading their seeds far and wide." One of the great turning points for ancient humanity was the discovery of a method by which sugar could actually be created and fermented into alcohol in the absence of honey or fruit. Unlike with wine from wine grapes, for example, this technique is what we now call beer brewing. End of quote. If we define beer as an alcoholic brew made from fermented grain, then the earliest beer is Chinese jiahu, which is not only based on fermented rice, but also includes wine from fermented grapes and mead from fermented honey. Talk about one-stop shopping. The great archaeoethnobotanist Dr. Patrick McGovern of the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, who's been called the Indiana Jones of ancient ales, carried out the seminal research on this 9,000-year-old ancient brew from Henan Province in central China, and he has teamed up with Dogfish Brewery in Delaware to recreate and market this extraordinary beverage, Chateau Jiahu, which I highly recommend. The first confirmed barley beer was from Godin Tepe in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran and is dated between 3,400 and 3,000 BCE. Shards of ancient jugs there were coated with a hard mineral deposit of calcium oxalate known as beer stone, proof that the jar had originally contained beer. The brewing of beer is more difficult than making simple wine. Wine grapes left to ferment will produce alcohol. The invention of beer involved more steps. Barley, or wheat, in a ceramic pot accidentally left out in the rain, then began to sprout, and that sprouted barley produced sugars. If you've had the opportunity to spend time with people who have no sweetener, no sugar, no honey on hand, you know that they prize any sweet edible. I have had the honor and privilege for many decades of working with the Akorio peoples, original hunter-gatherers from southern Suriname. I was always told to be careful going in the forest with the Akorios, because if they hear bees, which indicates the presence of honey, there'll be no way to catch up with them. Well, when I'm walking through the Amazon rainforest, I always have one indigenous guide in front of me and one behind me to make sure that I can't get lost. Well, I was disregarding the advice I'd gotten, and I was in the jungle with two Akorios, one in front, one in back, and one of them cocked his ears and said, "Wana," which means bees, which means honey, and off they went, leaving me all by my lonesome. What this means, as I was saying, is that people who don't have a sweetener on hand, no sugar, for example, or no honey in a jar, will prize anything sweet and edible. Therefore, the grain gruel in the Middle East would have been prized. It undoubtedly became even more appealing when, after a few days, yeast from the air settled into the brew, that is the water in the grain, fermenting the sugars into alcohol, turning the cereal gruel into a fizzy and slightly inebriating brew. Since the alcohol killed any microbes, it was healthier to drink than water, full of vitamins, nutrients, and calories, and in at least a few locales, as we discussed, antibiotics, and induced a mild euphoria. Beer was an integral component of the early cultures of the Fertile Crescent and the Nile Valley. The Sumerians were one of those early groups living mostly in the southern part of this region in what is now Iraq. As mentioned, though, the earliest barley beer remains were from Godin Tepe in what is now Iran, which was an outpost of the Sumerian Empire. Tom Standage, in his wonderful book, A History of the World in Six Glasses, memorably wrote, quote, "Beer is a liquid relic from human prehistory, and its origins are closely intertwined with the origins of civilization itself." The invention of agriculture and the emergence of the first city-states in Sumeria catalyzed a constellation of novel and interdependent technologies all connected to beer: the plow, to plant the grain; irrigation, to water the grain; the wheel, to carry the grain in a cart; measurements and surveying, to demarcate the agricultural fields; meteorology and astronomy, to better understand and predict the weather; and most importantly, writing. To the best of our knowledge, writing was invented by the Sumerians around 3500 BCE on clay tablets using a symbolic script known as cuneiform. Many of those tablets survive to the current day, often detailing the role of beer in Mesopotamian society, from its importance in daily life, religion, and the economy, including details of production and consumption to brewing techniques and recipe. Dr. Stephen Tinney of the Penn Museum, an authority on the linguistics of the Fertile Crescent, said, quote, "The reason for inventing writing was the need to record the production and distribution of commodities like beer. Beer was essential to the people, essential for their nutrition, and essential to the origin of writing." One odd aspect of these early beers is that many were made from bread, rather than just the grains themselves. Bread was crumbled into water, and ambient yeast converted the sugar into alcohol. This was a way of using stale bread, thus extending the shelf life of an important foodstuff, as well as a means of producing beers with different flavors and aromas. Not only did this bread beer provide a bit of gustatory diversity for cultures subsisting on a monotonous diet, but it also offered additional dietary benefits, since fermentation made nutrients in the grain more accessible and provided additional calories through the alcohol content in the beer. The most memorable manifestation of Sumerian beer culture that has survived is the hymn to Ninkasi, recorded about 1800 BCE, but, like the Iliad and the Odyssey 1,000 years later, originally composed as an oral poem much, much earlier. Ninkasi was the goddess of fertility, harvest, love-making, war-making, and beer and brewing. Obviously, a very busy lady. Ninkasi was the deity who not only prepared beer for the other gods, but who also taught the process to humans as well. Her hymn was a drinking song that included instructions for brewing, while also celebrating beer's integral role in daily life and communal gatherings. Ninkasi was, quote, "the lady who fills the mouth, the one who pours the fragrant beer in the glass, which is like the Tigris and the Euphrates joined." End of quote. Sumerians were no slouches when it came to beer diversity. They produced at least 8 types of barley beer, 8 types of emmer beer, emmer is a primitive wheat, and another 3 from mixed grains. Almost half the grain grown in Sumer was for beer production. Though widely considered the cradle of civilization, Sumer was eventually eclipsed by the rise of Babylonia, yet another Mesopotamian civilization. Their most famous ruler was Hammurabi. 1792 BCE to 1750 BCE, who promulgated one of the first set of legal statutes in history, the famous Code of Hammurabi. As beer was as important to the Babylonians as it had been earlier to the Sumerians, Hammurabi's code recognized 20 different varieties of brew, including black beer, red beer, and wheat beer, according to Gavin Smith's Global History of Beer. The code also featured major provisions regarding the production and sale of the brew. There were regulations on quality control, price controls, minimum wages, and rules governing the behavior of both tavern owners and their patrons. The next stop of note in the prehistory and history of beer was ancient Egypt. As was the case in Mesopotamia, beer represented much more than a beverage. It held cultural, religious, and economic significance. Members of all social strata drank beer, although wine eventually became the preferred drink of the priestly classes and the pharaoh. Nonetheless, King Tut was buried with ample supplies of both beer and wine to slake his thirst in the afterlife. As was the case with wine, beer is amply documented in both hieroglyphics and on Egyptian tomb paintings that depict its production and consumption. Because these early beers contained a few byproducts that were not sieved out, tomb drawings often feature people drinking through long straws to avoid the impurities and bread residues floating atop the brew. In fact, archaeologists can distinguish between beer and wine drinkers depicted in tomb art because the former are drinking through straws and the latter directly from cups and chalices. The great Greek mercenary Xenophon observed this on his long march from Persia to Greece, where he noted that, quote, the Armenians drank barley wine, that is beer, in mixing bowls. The barley itself was on top, and in the bowl were reeds, that is to say, straws. When somebody was thirsty, he had to take these in his mouth and suck. In ancient Egypt, beer often served as a means of payment for manual laborers. The workers who built the pyramids received large rations of beer, which they undoubtedly appreciated after having, literally, slaved away in the hot desert sun all day. Note that this contradicts much of what the public believes about the construction of the pyramids in ancient Egypt. The laborers were Egyptian workers paid in beer, not Jewish slaves paid with Manischewitz wine. As such, the production of beer was a major economic activity. In the words of the Oxford Companion to Beer, quote, great grain stores were built, and the Egyptian economy was underpinned by bread and beer. Unless you believe the ancient Egyptians drank nothing but the dull and featureless lagers that most Americans consumed in the latter half of the 20th century, know that in the Nile Valley thousands of years ago they were producing and enjoying dark beer, sweet beer, thick beer, the beer of truth, the beer of the protector, and the beer of eternity. Take that, Budweiser. The next cultures who ruled the region, the ancient Greeks and Romans, treated both beer and beer drinkers with absolute disdain. Wine served as a touchstone of Greek civilization, central to their cultural identity. As I mentioned in our episode on the ethnobotany of wine, ancient Greeks believed that truly civilized people spoke Greek and drank wine. Ignorance of both the Greek language and viticulture, especially by cultures that favored beer, was regarded as the hallmark of barbarians and savages. The Romans shared this contempt for the brew. The historian Tacitus wrote, quote, to drink, the Germans have a horrible beverage fermented from barley or wheat. The Emperor Justinian composed a poem in which he claimed the scent of wine was that of nectar, while the smell of beer was that of a goat. Gavin Smith elegantly stated the Roman disdain. The Romans did not understand the attractions of beer, being more in love with the grape than the grain. I love that quote, so I'm going to repeat it. The Romans did not understand the attractions of beer, being more in love with the grape than the grain. The only positive comment I could find from ancient Rome was penned by the great naturalist Pliny in writing about the beer so beloved by these barbarian tribes. Quote, so exquisite is the cunning of mankind in gratifying their vices and appetites that they have invented a method to make water itself produce intoxication." End of quote. One of the interesting aspects of the beer story is that much of the earliest brewing was carried out by women. In the words of spirits historian Camper English, quote, "Throughout history, brewing beer was women's work in the home, as baking and brewing could be accomplished with the same set of ingredients. Sometimes women produced enough beer to give away or sell, and some opened taverns or inns in their home or adjacent to them. But whenever brewing expanded from a small operation into a larger commercial one, men took over, and women with power and independence were villainized. Women were ousted from the brewing business by monasteries brewing ale to sell to local communities." This shift occurred as civilization entered the Dark Ages around 500 AD. Monasteries became refuges from the chaos and centers of literacy, learning, and culture. Monks became brewers, both to sustain themselves, to avoid drinking polluted water, and to provide sustenance and hospitality to weary travelers, and to generate revenue to support both their communities and their charitable activities. Monastic brewing came to be considered sacred labor, and they not only refined and standardized their brewing techniques, but experimented with different grains and other plants, including hops, which were one of the most revolutionary developments in beer history. And some monasteries still brew beer. The Trappist monks in Belgium produced popular double beers like Chimay. Prior to this, the most widely used beer additive and preservative was an herbal mix known as Groot, which contained medicinal herbs like yarrow and bog myrtle, which added both flavor and served as a preservative. Hops, however, proved far better at both. The inflorescences, what we look at as the flower cones, the inflorescences of the hop plant remained the contemporary preference for imparting aroma and flavor, particularly bitterness, the so-called hoppy flavor, to contemporary beer. The Vikings in northern Europe may have been among the first to employ hops as both a beer preservative and a flavoring agent, but the practice was widespread in monasteries during the Middle Ages, although their claim to fame in beer history was not botanical. The Vikings were known to drink their beer from the skulls of their slain enemies. The modern Scandinavian toast of skål was supposedly derived from the word for skull, at least according to some accounts. One of the first people to write about hops from a scientific perspective was the pioneering ethnobotanist known as Hildegard von Bingen. Born in Germany in 1098, von Bingen was not just an ethnobotanist, but also a Benedictine abbess, a biologist, a composer, a gardener, a healer, a mystic, a philosopher, a playwright, a medical writer, and, seemingly, a shaman who regularly had visions and proclaimed the need to heal on both a physical and a spiritual plane. She wrote about the connection between the well-being of the natural world and that of the individual, sort of a precursor to the Gaia hypothesis, but written 1,000 years earlier than James Lovelock's landmark hypothesis. Von Bingen wrote extensively on the medicinal properties of plants, animals, and even minerals. And among her other achievements, she was probably the first scientist to note, correctly, that hops were an effective beer preservative. One odd botanical note: hops are classified by botanists as members of a small plant family known as the Cannabaceae. The only other genus belonging to this group is cannabis. In our previous episode on marijuana, I noted that a botanical family consisting solely of cannabis, which is marijuana, and hops, which is used to make beer, sounds more like a college frat party than a scientific classification. In addition to standardizing hops as the primary source of flavor and the most common preservative, monasteries played a fundamental role in developing a new category of beer. With no understanding of microbiology, beer brewers since time immemorial faced the problem of beer spoilage due to bacterial infection, particularly during warm months. In the Middle Ages, Bavarian monks did their brewing in cellars and caves where cooler temperatures prevailed. Unlike the yeast that thrived near the surface in warmer temperatures, the yeast in the bottom of these barrels produced a more mellow beer, now widely known as lager, derived from the German term lagern, which means to store. Beer produced by the more traditional methodology, that is, with top fermenting yeast, is now known as ale. So the two major categories today are ale and lager. A brief bit of biology. Yeast is a microorganism, actually a type of fungus. In beer brewing, it takes sugars and malted grains, usually barley, and converts them to alcohol and carbon dioxide, in other words, fermentation, which is how water with grain becomes bubbly and alcoholic, in other words, beer. The only indelible mark that Imperial Rome left on brewing culture was their word for beer, cerevisiae. Not only is this the source of the Spanish word for beer, cerveza, and the Portuguese word for beer, cerveja, but it is the scientific epithet for the yeast used to make ale, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. On the printed page, the name Saccharomyces cerevisiae is over 5,000 times longer than the yeast itself. It is also used to make bread and wine and is sold as baker's yeast and brewer's yeast. The key to the production of lager beer is a different species, Saccharomyces pastorianus, believed to be a hybrid between S. cerevisiae and S. bayanus. Because it permits fermentation at lower temperatures, lager beer is often characterized as having cleaner and crisper flavors than ale. On the other hand, ales typically are more aromatic, fruity, and bitter.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, join us for part 2 of this discussion about beer as we learn more about this drink of the gods.